Hey guys, it's Divest. Today I wanted to talk about my interpretation of George Orwell's 1984. Let's get into it. So I read 1984 in English for the first time recently, and I was struck by what was essentially a heavy-handed commentary on the British condition during the 40s, disguised as a criticism of socialism to not only slip it by the censors of the era, but to actually get it proliferated by the British and American government as anti-communist propaganda. If you think about it, Orwell had already written Animal Farm, so he didn't need to create a dystopian future about totalitarian socialism, since he already accurately described Stalinism. What stuck out to me about 1984 was Britain's status as subservient to America. It's called Airstrip 1, they use dollars instead of pounds, battleships are called floating fortresses. Then I started to read more about the context behind the book, how it was originally to be set in 1948, and how Orwell worked the same job as Whiston as a BBC propagandist. I started to contextualize 1984 as the veiled expression of paranoia by a British socialist who was trying to explain World War II and the Cold War as conspiracy, and couldn't express it openly. Much in the same way that Animal Farm serves as an allegory to the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. The harsh rationing, the endless war of shifting alliances, the rewriting of history, the bombardment of London, the censorship, and most importantly, the private belief of the intellectuals that this is a form of social engineering, are all endemic of the condition of the United Kingdom during the Second World War. So within that context, I would be willing to dismiss 1984's futurism as another piece of great British literature that completely missed the mark on their predictions for the future. Like the then contemporary political commentary on the Cold War in Watchmen that predicted a nuclear war with the Soviet Union in response to the aggressive foreign policy of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. But as I ruminated on it, I realized that Orwell did accurately predict the way that British people would discuss history going forward. Now, I was inspired to write this after reading the synopsis of some Ridley Scott films on Wikipedia this morning. I recognized the name Ridley Scott from the Alien franchise, but I didn't know anything about him. His filmography mostly consisted of historical set films, each with their own subsection about historical inaccuracies. To give you some examples of historical inaccuracies in the eponymous film Napoleon, he is depicted as having witnessed the execution of Marie Antoinette in Paris firsthand, despite commanding the Republican artillery at the siege of Toulon at the time. The 100 Days' War and Battle of Waterloo are prompted by Napoleon attempting to meet his ex-wife while she is dying, when in reality she had died a year prior. What is important here is not just the egregious nature of the historical inaccuracies, which is fine as a creative liberty in order to make a more artistic and compelling film. It was also Ridley Scott's reaction to it. And I quote,
"Historians are all fucking liars. My alternative facts are the truth. Because the people alive today weren't there to witness these events firsthand. Now quit scrutinizing me, mate."
So I had caught on to the fact he was British before he even said mate. The defensive attitude, anti-intellectualism, and total misunderstanding of how historians work is a common characteristic of British people who are interested in history. This dissent is even more impressive considering how before the 20th century, Britain produced many of the greatest intellectuals in the world. Granted, they didn't produce any worthwhile arts or philosophy, but there were a great number of sciences and technologies that were fathered by the Brits, in part because they were so inquisitive and pursued the truth. So what went wrong exactly? Why are British people so fucking stupid now that one of their greatest living artists cries like a little bitch and makes fallacious arguments akin to a flat earther? I can answer that too. The decline of British intellectualism started because of the First World War and the impact it had on the United Kingdom, necessitating the collective psychological defense mechanisms described by Orwell. Before the First World War, the United Kingdom had never suffered the trauma of a major industrial war. Thanks to their geography and diplomacy, they were isolated from the conflicts that dominated Europe, and their social organization reflected that. They didn't use conscription and would play sides in the conflict, using their economic influence to come out ahead. When they did fight in major wars like Crimea or the Napoleonic Wars, it was through proxies with token British forces. In contrast, continental Europeans had by necessity developed a system of mobilizing their entire population for a total war through conscription thanks to nationalism. Their people were ready and willing to sacrifice young boys because they understood that the force of arms was the only thing keeping them from being conquered and exploited by their neighbors. So in the years preceding the First World War, Germany had started to rival the Brits as the dominant power in Europe, and Britain responded by throwing their chips in with the French. Then, by July of 1914, the European powers mutually agreed to carve up Europe after running out of continents to divide, but couldn't agree on where the lines should be drawn. While the upper classes in Britain were cynically eyeing German colonies in Africa for exploitation, they needed to sell the war to the working-class populace who gained nothing from British imperialism and had the potential to lose everything from the war. So the first great British lie was that they were waging a war for liberty. This would have been a footnote in history like the hysteria around the sinking of the USS Maine, if the British plan for a pincer war by their alliance against Germany had succeeded. Instead, the Russians lost at Tannenberg, the French at Lorraine, and the British army was cut down at Flanders. Too late to back down now, the Brits needed more bodies, and more bodies needed more lies to justify the needless suffering of their population. The count of both continued to grow larger until it became all-consuming. Britain lost more people during the First World War than all other wars in their history combined, including the Second, and the war was only resolved in their favor, not with British strength of will or technology, but by another lie, this time to the American people. America was unable to remain neutral during the First World War. Thanks to the British blockade, American goods could only be sold to Britain and her allies, and as more bodies were drawn into the fight, the loss of economic production was made up for by increasing imports from the United States, financed through loans from American banks. This too required a constant stream of British propaganda to silence out any doubt in the righteousness of American war profiteering. When the Russian Empire collapsed, this sent shockwaves through the booming American economy and triggered the most expensive federal bailout in American history. In order to prevent France and Britain from defaulting on their debt, the British lie had to be sold to American people so they would willingly spend 440,000 lives for naught. So the Americans joined the war and psychologically crushed the German army in France, reversing their hard-earned gains they made on the Western Front and causing the German soldiers to resolve the humiliation of defeat over a pointless death in an unwinnable war. The truth is that Britain didn't win the First World War. They lost just as the Central Powers did. But the British people chose to believe they had won the war despite this, so that they wouldn't have to reconcile the uncomfortable truth or learn from their mistakes. An interesting facet of this is how much the British story of the First World War resembles the story of the Soviet Union during the Second. Geopolitical blunders and revanchism led them down a path of self-annihilation, only to come out in the end on the same side as the victors, which they warped into a national myth while their civilization crumbled from the crippling, self-inflicted wounds of the conflict. Then during the Second World War, Britain was fully occupied by America, only after the outcome of the war they had sacrificed so much for and called a victory was reversed in a few months. Germany eclipsed Britain as the dominant power in Europe, and the only alternative to Nazi domination of Britain was subservience to the United States, giving birth to Airstrip 1, an island parked off the coast of Europe but forever excluded from it and subservient to the Americas. Within a little over a decade, British people went from loving Hitler to hating him, then went from loving Stalin to hating him as the geopolitical situation developed. In fact, Animal Farm was created as an allegory because at the time, it was illegal to scrutinize the Soviet Union. In 20 years, the Brits went from forming Poland to becoming Poland as the United States invaded and made them grateful for it, in the same way the Nazis endeared the Poles to Stalin. This is what I love about 1984 so much. Orwell was able to describe what it felt like being British during the Second World War in a way that no one else did. The inherent contradiction that would pass over the head of the simple-minded masses, or at least be impossible for them to express coherently, is laid bare in the text. And once they started lying about the big stuff, they had to start lying about everything no matter how petty, just like the Russians do. The only difference is that Brits have a slightly better grasp of the English language than the Russians, so it's easy for their disinformation to reach an American audience. The entire study of history in the English language has been polluted by British disinformation. You can't correct a British person when they hold an objectively incorrect view, because they hold that view in order to resolve cognitive dissonance about their place in the world. The truth is emotionally harmful to them, and to accept new information, they would have to lose some fundamental character that makes them British. And when sciences get in the way of their narrative, then it has to be disregarded too. This is how you go from the genius of men like Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin to the modern Brit, insecure and ignorant, but the perfect orator for newspeak. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you found this video insightful or if you want to argue with me in the comments. Until next time, this has been Divest.